On the day of our engagement, Stephen Smith shocked everyone by walking out in front of the whole crowd. I took the microphone, stepped up to the stage, and with a grin I said, "Well, I guess today's just going to be about celebrating my promotion. So please, enjoy the food and drinks, help yourselves." A while later, Stephen tried to make up for it by suggesting we throw another engagement party. But I handed him an invitation instead and said, "Let's not bother with an engagement anymore. Come to my wedding instead." Chapter 1. Linda, I'm really sorry, but something's come up with Ashley. I have to go check on her right now. Stephen rushed over, car keys in hand, looking apologetic but clearly in a hurry. I had just finished putting on my dress, ready to head out and make a toast to our guests. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. "Stephen, do you realize today is our engagement party?" This was our day, the day we'd been planning for. My family had taken time off work to be here. Stephen's parents were already seated at the head table, waiting for us to make our entrance. And now, Stephen's saying he needs to rush off to Ashley? What kind of joke was this? Stephen's face was tense, his voice was urgent. "I promised I'd marry you, didn't I? Isn't that what matters? We can always throw another party, but Ashley's in trouble, this could be serious." I stepped in front of the door, blocking his way, my eyes locked on his. "And what if it's not serious, Stephen? What if this is just another one of her stunts?" At that, Stephen bristled like a cat with its tail stepped on. "Linda, how can you even say that? Where's your compassion? Ashley's practically like a sister to you, you've known her forever. Can't you put off one little party for her sake?" Here we go again. It's always the same story. Ashley causes a scene, makes everything about her, and somehow, I'm the one who ends up looking like the bad guy. It's been this way since we were kids. No matter what Ashley did, the moment I called her out, I was the one being unreasonable, jealous, or selfish. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then stepped aside. Stephen rushed past me out the door, slamming it so hard it bounced off the wall and hit me on the shoulder. The pain snapped me back to reality. A knock came from outside. The host was asking if we were ready to begin. I stood there for a few seconds, gathering my thoughts. Then I opened the door and said calmly, "The engagement party's off." I apologized and quickly explained the situation to the host. Funny enough, Stephen hadn't wanted to hire her in the first place, but I insisted. He thought she wasn't engaging enough. But right now, I was glad I'd stuck to my decision. She immediately understood and worked with me to come up with a new plan. Inside the banquet hall, our guests were still waiting. I took a deep breath, lifted the hem of my dress, and walked out onto the stage. I grabbed the microphone and with a steady voice, announced, "Well, change of plans, everyone. Today isn't an engagement party anymore. It's my promotion celebration. So please, eat, drink, and enjoy yourselves." The room buzzed with murmurs of confusion. My parents, along with Stephen's, stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. I didn't offer much more explanation. I handed the microphone back to the host, who quickly took control and smoothed things over. Soon enough, the guests were back to enjoying the party, and aside from a few curious glances, no one asked about what had happened. Later that evening, after all the guests had left, I invited both sets of parents back to my place. I pulled out the engagement rings Stephen and I had picked out together and handed them to his parents. "I think it's clear that things didn't work out between Stephen and me. These rings belong to you now. I hope you'll find someone truly deserving of your son." They refused to accept it, insisting they would talk to Stephen and get him to straighten up. Later that night, I checked my phone. Ashley had posted something new. He said he'd never let go of my hand. The picture? A close-up of two hands intertwined. One of them was wearing the exact same ring I'd bought for Stephen. Stephen's mom, who had been sitting beside me, immediately recognized the ring. She tried to make excuses, hoping I'd be lenient, that I'd forgive. "Linda, sweetheart, I know Stephen made a mistake. Can't you forgive him just this once? I'm so sorry for what he did." But I shook my head and replied calmly, "This has nothing to do with you or Mr. Smith. I've never blamed either of you. But Steven is a grown man. He makes his own choices, and none of us can control that." I smiled gently before continuing. "But after tonight, I've made up my mind. I won't be putting up with his behavior anymore." The so-called emergency with Ashley? Just another excuse to pull him away. It always seemed like something urgent came up whenever Steven and I made progress in our relationship, and every time, it was resolved just as quickly as it started. It was a pattern. One I'd grown tired of. Ashley was terrified that once Steven and I were married, his attention would shift away from her. So, she constantly tested him to see if she still held the same place in his heart. And every single time, Steven showed her that she did. But you know what? I'm done fighting for someone who can't even decide where his loyalty lies. Letting go doesn't hurt nearly as much as holding on. Chapter 2. I got up early for my morning run and grabbed some breakfast on the way back. I could tell Mom had something on her mind. She kept glancing my way. Finally, she spoke up. "Linda, about what you mentioned yesterday, a promotion celebration. What's that all about?" I swallowed the bite of my bread and answered casually. "Mom, my boss is opening a new branch up north and asked if I'd like to help set things up. It's a great opportunity, so I said yes. But didn't you say before that it's too cold up there and you didn't want to go?" My younger brother looked up from his breakfast, clearly confused. Before I could respond, Mom quickly handed him his straw for the milk, trying to hush him up. I smiled and said, "Well, sometimes the offer's just too good to refuse." The truth is, I hadn't been keen on leaving at first. Steven wanted me to stay close. We were supposed to get married soon, and long distance wasn't exactly ideal for maintaining a relationship. That's why I initially turned the offer down. But now, I've changed my mind. He's no longer someone worth waiting around for. When I walked into the office, I could see the surprise flicker across my boss's face. We'd worked together for years, and he knew I rarely changed my mind once I made a decision. This was unexpected. "I thought for sure you were set on staying," he said, raising an eyebrow. "I'd even started looking for someone to take over. But if you've had a change of heart, the position is still yours. Do you need some time off to get things sorted?" I shook my head. "No need. I'm ready to dive in." After wrapping up my work and handing over everything to my assistant, I booked a flight for the next day. As soon as the plane touched down and I switched off airplane mode, my phone started buzzing. Dozens of missed calls lit up my screen. There were calls from my future in-laws, my parents, and even my little brother. But what really caught me off guard was a call from Ashley. It seemed like she'd called right after Steven, probably just as I was still in the air. I wasn't about to deal with all that, so I called my parents back instead. They picked up right away. "Linda, you've landed, right? Did someone come to pick you up? I hear it's freezing up there, make sure you're bundled up." Mom's voice trailed off as my brother grabbed the phone. "Hey, sis! So, that guy called the house earlier, trying to figure out where you were. But don't worry, I didn't tell him a thing. Let him squirm for a bit, serves him right for being such an idiot." I couldn't help but laugh softly. I'm not trying to ignore anyone on purpose. We're done. There's no need to make a big deal out of it. There was a pause on the other end, followed by some muffled background noise. Then my brother's voice came through again, quieter this time. "So, you're really done with him?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah. It's over." We talked for a few more minutes, mostly small talk before I hung up. After leaving the airport, I got into a car. The driver was an old friend of mine. When David found out I was heading to Stormvale, he insisted on picking me up himself. I couldn't exactly turn him down, so I gave him my flight details. As we drove, he couldn't help but ask, "So, what made you decide to come to such a cold place? I thought you hated the cold. And where's Steven? I figured he'd be glued to your side." I pressed my fingers to my temples, massaging away the tension. I'm here to handle some business for the new branch. As for Steven, well, he's off enjoying life with Ashley. We're done. David gave me a quick side eye, clearly caught off guard. I had to remind him to keep his eyes on the road so we wouldn't end up in a ditch. Honestly, I wasn't about to lose sleep over a guy like Steven. Life goes on, and I've got better things to focus on. After a while, David pulled over to the side of the road, wearing that determined look that said he wasn't going to drop the subject until I spilled everything. I sighed, resigned to the fact that I'd have to tell him the whole messy story about Steven and Ashley. Steven always had one major misconception. He thought Ashley and I were ever really friends. We weren't. From the moment I met her, she rubbed me the wrong way. Her favorite excuse for everything was, "I'm scared of being alone." Even on my birthday, she pulled that card. She claimed she was too scared to stay home alone, and before the candles were even blown out, Steven ran off to comfort her. The next morning, he showed up with a cake, like that was supposed to make me feel better. "Come on, don't be mad," he said, all casual. I just felt bad for her. He swore I was his number one, that no one else mattered. But it wasn't long before I saw something that made me question all of that. A figurine I had given him a special gift had somehow ended up in someone else's hands. Then, Ashley insisted that I come over to their apartment. I really didn't want to go, but I gave in. As I walked into the living room, I noticed something on the floor, a one-piece figurine, shattered to pieces. It had fallen off the table, and Ashley was lazily sweeping up the mess, moving so slowly it almost felt deliberate. It made me sick to my stomach. I recognized it instantly. It was the figurine I had given Steven. The one with the inscription on the base. To Steven, the goofiest guy I know, love Linda. Forever. When I gave it to him, he had been over the moon, hugging me tight and swearing he'd never let it out of his sight. And yet, here it was, lying broken in Ashley's living room. I swallowed my anger and asked, as calmly as I could, why it was here. Ashley gave me this innocent look with a dramatic sigh for good measure. "Oh, this?" Steven was so sweet, he lent it to me because he knows how much I love One Piece and Luffy. I accidentally knocked it over. Such a shame, right? Steven's going to be so upset when he finds out. But Linda, please don't tell him, okay? Back then, I didn't know how to hide my emotions. I was too young, too raw. I didn't say a word. I just picked up the broken vase and left. For the next few days, I couldn't even bring myself to talk to either of them. When Steven finally came to apologize, I thought it would be the same old story, him brushing it off, me forgiving him too easily. But this time, he seemed more serious. "I only lent it to her for a little while," he said, his face unusually grim. "I told her she could always reach out to me if she felt lonely. You knew that. And you weren't that upset when this happened, so why are you making it into such a big deal now? Causing trouble for Ashley?" Chapter 3. Causing trouble for Ashley? I blinked, confused. What are you talking about? When did I ever cause her trouble? Steven's face was flushed with anger. Don't play dumb, Linda. You went to her place and smashed her figurine on purpose. Seriously? How petty can you be? I felt a surge of frustration, but I tried to stay calm. That figurine? She broke it herself. I didn't even touch it. She told me you gave it to her. Steven didn't have it. Come on, Linda. If you're going to lie, at least make it believable. Ashley loved that thing. She wouldn't even let people borrow it without wrapping it up like it was some kind of treasure. There's no way she'd just break it. I get that you're upset, but don't go blaming her for something she didn't do. He laid into me, calling me jealous and childish. And despite feeling hurt, I stood my ground and refused to apologize. After that, we didn't talk for a long time. There was this cold, uncomfortable silence between us. It wasn't until Ashley left town for a while to stay with her grandma that things started to thaw between Steven and me. I never expected her to come back into our lives. By that time, Steven and I were officially a couple. He even threw me a birthday party. Everything was going great until Ashley showed up. She walked in behind Steven, who was wearing a white dress and looking all shy and innocent. "Happy birthday, Linda," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The room went silent. My friends looked at her like they had no idea who she was, which they didn't. Steven quickly jumped in to introduce her as his little sister, which honestly just made my stomach turn. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but when Steven gave me that pleading look, the one that said please, just this once, I let it slide. But Ashley wasn't done. She pulled out a big box she'd brought with her and fished out a Luffy figurine, holding it out to me. "Here, Linda. I know the last one caused a fight between you and Steven, so I wanted to give this to you. I hope it'll help make things right and that you and Steven can be happy together." The room felt like it had been sucked into a vacuum. The awkwardness was suffocating. Steven looked like he was about to explode. After that, my birthday party just got weird. And it didn't stop there. Every time I needed Steven for something, Ashley would come up with some kind of emergency that needed his immediate attention. Steven would always say the same thing: "She doesn't know anyone here, I'm the only one she can turn to." I tried to be understanding. I really did. But how do you explain to your boyfriend that sometimes being there for you should come first? Even when I was upset, Steven kept insisting that I was his priority. He even planned a romantic getaway for us to make up for all the missed time. I ended up turning down a major work project because of that trip. I still remember my boss's voice, heavy with disappointment. "You realize what this opportunity means, right?" Of course I knew. It was a shot at a promotion. More money. Recognition for all the hard work I'd put in. But I turned it down anyway. And then Steven bailed on the trip. I found out where he was through social media. Ashley had posted a photo her in a skimpy bikini, standing by the pool, with Steven's arm casually draped around her waist. She looked pale, like she'd just gone through something traumatic, but somehow still managed to make it look inviting. The image burned in my mind. I spent the next 24 hours locked in our hotel room, not answering calls, not responding to texts. Just sitting there, staring at the wall. When Steven finally showed up, he rushed to explain. "Ashley called me right before we were supposed to leave. She almost drowned. She was terrified. I didn't have time to call you, I had to be there for her." Apparently, it wasn't as dramatic as it sounded. She'd been taking swimming lessons, panicked when she cramped up, and swallowed some water. But she was fine. She just wanted Steven to stay with her a little longer, to calm down. After hearing the whole story, I was ready to walk away from the relationship. But Steven wouldn't let me go. He held me tight, apologizing over and over, swearing he'd never let anything like that happen again. He even reminded me that our families had already started talking about setting a wedding date. I stared at the ring on his hand, my mind racing. For a split second, I thought, maybe once we're married, he'll finally put me first. Against my better judgment, I agreed to stay. But what happened next? That was like the universe giving me a slap in the face. Of course, it hurt. How could it not? Steven and I had known each other for so long, and yet, I was losing him to someone who had only been around for 5 minutes. I glanced over at David, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, looking like he was about to lose it. Just when I thought he was going to say something, my phone rang. It was Steven. Chapter 4. "Linda, we're about to get married, can't you be a little more reasonable?" Steven's voice was strained, almost pleading. "Ashley's really in a tough spot this time. You don't need to act like you did when we were kids. Can't you just let it go and be a bit more understanding?" I waited until he was done and then replied quietly. "Fine, I'll try to be more understanding." He clearly wasn't expecting me to agree so easily, and his tone softened almost immediately. "Okay, great. So, just apologize to Ashley, and this whole thing will be over. Once you say sorry, we can move on." Gripping my phone, I asked again to make sure I heard him right. "So, All I have to do is apologize to Ashley? That's it?" He responded without hesitation. "Yeah, that's all." "Perfect." He said it himself. Now I knew for sure where I stood and where this relationship was headed. I smiled to myself and spoke into the phone. "Ashley, I'm so sorry for wasting your time. I really hope you and Steven have a wonderful life together." Before Steven could say anything, David snatched the phone from my hand. "Steven, you idiot. Who said Linda's the one who needs to apologize? You'll regret this, mark my words." David hung up the phone with a sharp click, still fuming. Then he turned to me, a little sheepish. "Sorry about that. I didn't mean to lose my temper." I couldn't help but smile and shake my head. "Don't worry about it. I'm not mad. Why would I get upset over someone who wasn't even worth it anymore?" I wasn't sure how Steven had found me, but he was there, standing outside my door. When I opened it, he looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his beard unkempt. He didn't even look like the Steven I knew. "Steven? How did you find me? What are you doing here?" He stared at me intensely, his voice low and serious. "What did you mean by what you said the other day?" I blinked, confused. "Which part?" His lips thinned as he held back whatever frustration was bubbling beneath the surface. "You wished me and Ashley happiness. Why would you say that?" "Ah, so that's what brought him here." I thought back to that moment. I had been convinced he had feelings for Ashley. Maybe I'd misread the situation? Could there be someone else he had feelings for? If that was the case, my congratulations might have missed the mark. I sighed, deciding to clarify. "My mistake. I didn't realize Ashley wasn't the one you cared about. So, who is it? Maybe I should offer my congratulations to the right person next time." Steven's eyes flashed with frustration, a hint of something deeper behind them. "You know that's not what I meant, Linda. You know exactly what I meant." I raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me. What is it that I'm supposed to know?" His fists clenched, his voice trembling with emotion. "You know it's always been you. I've told you before I only ever wanted you. I want you, and I want us to spend our lives together." This conversation was quickly becoming more uncomfortable than I'd expected. I brushed off the imaginary dust on my clothes, more out of restlessness than anything else, and moved to close the door. But Steven grabbed the door frame, stopping me. What was he playing at? Why was he acting like he was the one who had been wronged? I was the one left hanging. I was the one humiliated. And now he's here, acting like he's the one nursing a broken heart. "Is this about the engagement being called off?" I asked, exasperated. "Is that why you're upset?" "Look, Steven, that was a one-time thing. I'll make it up to you. We can have a bigger, more extravagant wedding if that's what you want." He stayed there, talking like he could fix everything by throwing a grander party, while the neighbors started peeking out of their doors, curious about the scene he was causing. The last thing I wanted was to become their evening entertainment. I told Steven to wait downstairs at the cafe while I finished up what I was working on. Once I was done, I'd meet him there. When I finally showed up at the cafe, Steven was still sitting at the same table, staring at his phone. As I sat down, I noticed the screen lighting up with several missed calls. All from Ashley. I gestured toward the phone. "Maybe you should return those calls. She might actually need something." He looked at the phone briefly and then shrugged. "I told her friends to handle it. They'll take care of whatever's going on." I nodded. "Oh, so it seems she's not as alone as she claims." Steven looked at me with a mix of desperation and longing, like he wanted to reach out and hold my hand. But I pulled back, keeping my distance. I had my boundaries after all. And one of those boundaries? You don't get involved with someone else's boyfriend. Chapter 5. I stirred my coffee absently, the spoon clinking softly against the cup. I could see Steven shifting uncomfortably in his seat, so I decided to take him on a little trip down memory lane. Do you remember my birthday when we were kids? Everyone was singing for me, but you slipped away. Said you had to be with her because her parents weren't home. You promised me you'd be there for my birthday too, Stephen? Or have you forgotten? He opened his mouth quickly, scrambling to explain himself. That was because she was scared to be alone, Linda. You had all your friends around you. I thought it wouldn't be a big deal. I didn't let him finish. And that Luffy figurine? I went through so much trouble to get that for you. I had to beg my mom to forgive me after she found out how much I spent on it. I held on to it, wanting to surprise you. Then, one day, I saw it at Ashley's place. Do you know how that felt? I paused, remembering the sting in my chest. It hurt. Something I worked so hard to get for you, something that meant so much to me, was suddenly hers. Stephen looked panicked, his voice rising in urgency. She loved Luffy, but that particular figure was hard to find. I just let her borrow it for a few days, that's all. I shook my head, locking eyes with him. No, Stephen. That's not what happened. She told me you gave it to her. And then in front of me, she smashed it. My gift. I ran off crying, holding the broken pieces with your name still on them. I waited for you to explain. And when you finally showed up, you didn't defend me, you told me I was the one bullying her. He fell silent, no longer trying to defend himself. His face showed a mixture of guilt and regret. The conversation shifted, drifting back to the days when we had started dating. Our families had always been close, practically moving together over the years. Stephen and I spent so much time together that it seemed inevitable that we'd end up like this. But then Ashley came back into our lives. And God, I really thought I'd win this time. Even now, thinking about it left a bitter taste in my mouth. I sighed and continued. On my birthday, when she gave me that Luffy figurine, it wasn't a gift. It was a reminder. A reminder that I'd lost to her once. And the only reason she could even pull something like that off was because you kept taking her side. Anytime she needed something, whatever plans we had didn't matter. For example, when you canceled our beach trip because you were worried she might get hurt by the water, did it ever occur to you that I was alone in a strange hotel, scared out of my mind? I paused, keeping my voice steady, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in my words. You know I'm terrified of the dark, Stephen. His eyes were red now, and I could tell he was remembering. He'd booked a weekend getaway at this secluded hot spring resort, thinking it would make everything better. But the place was deep in the mountains, and that night, there was a power outage. The whole place went pitch black. He knew I couldn't handle complete darkness, not after everything that happened when I was a kid. I couldn't even sleep without a nightlight. That night, I didn't sleep at all. And in that half-asleep, terrified state, I'd agreed to marry him. Looking back, I couldn't believe I'd let things get that far. I laughed softly, shaking my head at the memory. You know, I said, my voice laced with irony. When you left that night, I was relieved. At least you made your choice. You chose her, and honestly, that made things clearer for me. So if anyone asks, make sure you tell them it was you who left. Don't worry, I'll give you that. I know how much you care about what people think. I smiled as I said it, but across from me, Stephen's eyes were brimming with tears. I stood up to leave, ready to walk away from all of this. But before I could take a step, I felt his hand grab my arm. Please, Linda. He choked out, his voice thick with desperation. I know I messed up. I see that now. I swear I'll change. You're the only one I've ever loved. It's always been you. I froze, his grip holding me in place. Slowly, I turned to face him, and what I saw shocked me. Tears were streaming down his face. I'd never seen him like this before. I tried to pull my arm free, but his grip tightened, his eyes pleading. No, Linda, don't go. Don't leave me. I sighed, feeling my patience wear thin. Stephen, you're the one who keeps walking away. Every single time. I looked down at his hand, still clutching my arm. How could someone hurt me over and over and still say they loved me? I couldn't wrap my head around it. Steven must have sensed the shift because suddenly, he let go. His hands fell to his sides and his voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'll never do this again. Please, just give me one more chance." This time, I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked out the door. And I didn't look back. Chapter 6. The new branch was just starting up, and I was so busy that I rarely went home. It wasn't until the new year that I finally took some time off to be with my parents. Steven's house was right next to mine, and I could see his yard from my window. But I pulled the curtains shut and didn't look outside. After the breakup, I deleted all of Steven's contact information. During the entire New Year holiday, even though I passed by Steven's house many times, I never went in. Even when Steven's mother warmly invited me over for a drink, I politely declined. On the 5th day of the new year, David came to my house to pay his respects. My dad, having heard how much he had helped me, insisted on him staying for a drink as a token of gratitude. I stayed with them, making sure David didn't get too drunk. Glancing out the window, I saw a familiar figure. My brother whispered to me, "That guy has been standing outside all day. I don't know who he's waiting for." I quickly told my brother to hush and called Steven's mother to explain the situation. She soon came out and took Steven home, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Then David asked me, "Once the branch is up and running, do you plan to stay there?" I was a bit taken aback by the question. "I'll probably stay. The main office has the boss, and I feel more at ease outside." David nodded, saying nothing more. The boss, recognizing my hard work, gave me several days off, allowing me to return to work after the Easter holiday. Surprisingly, David also delayed his return, insisting on going back with me. He chatted and joked along the way, but his smile faded when he glanced in the rearview mirror. "Look behind us. Steven is driving that car." I turned and saw it was indeed him. This was troubling. We had made it clear during the breakup, and I thought we could move on. But it seemed Steven was still holding on. Seeing David gripping the steering wheel tightly, he suggested, "Maybe you should find a new boyfriend to completely cut off his hopes." I was puzzled. A new boyfriend? Where would I find one? David cleared his throat, his face slightly flushed. "Well, if you don't mind, I could pretend to be your boyfriend." His words left me confused. I wasn't sure if he genuinely wanted to help or had other intentions. We had known each other for so long, and I never sensed his feelings went beyond friendship. Due to Steven's persistent harassment, I hesitated but eventually asked David to pick me up after work. When Steven saw David, his expression changed. "What are you doing here?" David smiled. "Picking up my girlfriend from work, of course." As I reached for the car door, Steven rushed to stop me. "Linda, you can't go with him." I gently pried his fingers off and got into the car. "Steven, please don't do this. You used to be so understanding." He slowly crouched down, holding his head in his hands. Watching him shrink in the rearview mirror, I felt a sudden sense of clarity. I used to cling tightly, not letting Steven near Ashley. But he always looked disappointed, calling me petty. Now that I was no longer so concerned, he couldn't handle it. Not long after, a girl waved us down. David slowed and asked what she needed. She glanced inside, her expression changing when she saw me. "Senior David, can you give me a ride? I have something to do near your place." David frowned, glancing at me, then shook his head. "No, I'm spending time with my girlfriend today. We're not going the same way. You should call a cab." With that, he closed the window and drove off. I said nothing. But David felt the need to explain. "That was a junior from my lab. She just transferred here, and I haven't seen her much." I found it amusing. We were just pretending to be a couple, he didn't need to explain so much. If it were Steven, it wouldn't be so complicated. Whenever Ashley needed him, Steven thought it was normal, just friends helping each other. If I intervened, I was accused of being unreasonable and petty. I've learned to mind my own business and not interfere in others' affairs. David watched me for a long time, seeing that I wasn't bothered. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. He was a good actor. Whenever Stephen was around, he played his part flawlessly. Once, while dining out, we saw Stephen at a nearby table. Suddenly, David received a call from his junior, his expression darkening. These things shouldn't involve me. If you need driving lessons, enroll in a driving school. If a light bulb is broken, call a repairman. If you need a ride, call a cab. Junior, I've told you, I have a girlfriend and I don't want to upset her. Hearing this, Stephen's eyes dimmed. At that moment, Ashley walked in. She immediately noticed me and David, her smile widening. Stephen, there you are. I've been looking for you. Why didn't you answer my calls? Stephen looked up, asking indifferently. What do you need? Ashley, in a sweet voice, held his hand and pleaded. The company changed the job requirements. I need to know how to drive. Can you teach me? I don't trust anyone else. Hearing this, my interest piqued, and I put down my chopsticks, looking their way, meeting Stephen's gaze. This excuse always worked for Ashley. Whenever she said she only trusted Stephen, he would feel sorry for her and rush to her aid, ignoring my objections. But this time seemed different. After hearing Ashley, Stephen looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for my reaction. Even David noticed and asked, "What is he waiting for? Does he expect you to stop him?" I patted his shoulder, smiling. You're overthinking. This has nothing to do with me. Hearing this, Stephen looked dejected. Seeing this, Ashley turned to me. Linda, Stephen and I are just friends. Friends help each other. Isn't that right? I smiled and nodded. Yes, you're right. Since you're best friends, Stephen should always be there for you. Ashley was thrilled. See? I knew you were the best, the most understanding. You wouldn't be jealous of Stephen helping me. But to her surprise, Stephen ignored her. David sensed something was off and quickly paid the bill, taking me away, leaving them to deal with it. Later, I heard Stephen lost control that day. He violently tore off Ashley's necklace and pushed her to the ground, causing her hand to be cut by the broken pieces, bleeding heavily. Mr. Smith had to bail him out. Not long after, Mr. Smith called me, sounding exhausted. Linda, Stephen went too far, but could you visit him? Just as a favor to me? Considering the close relationship between our families and Mr. Smith's past help to mine, I reluctantly agreed and brought. I was left with no choice but to agree. As we drove, I noticed a girl waving us down. David slowed and asked what she needed. She glanced inside, her expression changing when she saw me. Senior, can you give me a ride? I have something to do near your place. David frowned, glancing at me, then shook his head. No, I'm spending time with my girlfriend today. We're not going the same way. You should call a cab. With that, he closed the window and drove off. I said nothing. But David felt the need to explain. That was a junior from my lab. She just transferred here and I haven't seen her much. I found it amusing. We were just pretending to be a couple, he didn't need to explain so much. If it were Stephen, it wouldn't be so complicated. Whenever Ashley needed him, Stephen thought it was normal, just friends helping each other. If I intervened, I was accused of being unreasonable and petty. I've learned to mind my own business and not interfere in others' affairs. David watched me for a long time, seeing that I wasn't bothered. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. He was a good actor. Whenever Stephen was around, he played his part flawlessly. Once, while dining out, we saw Stephen at a nearby table. Suddenly, David received a call from his junior, his expression darkening. These things shouldn't involve me. If you need driving lessons, enroll in a driving school. If a light bulb is broken, call a repairman. If you need a ride, call a cab. Junior, I've told you, I have a girlfriend and I don't want to upset her. Hearing this, Stephen's eyes dimmed. At that moment, Ashley walked in. She immediately noticed me and David, her smile widening. "Stephen, there you are. I've been looking for you. Why didn't you answer my calls?" Stephen looked up, asking indifferently, "What do you need?" Ashley, in a sweet voice, held his hand and pleaded. "The company changed the job requirements. I need to know how to drive. Can you teach me? I don't trust anyone else." Hearing this, my interest piqued, and I put down my chopsticks, looking their way, meeting Stephen's gaze. This excuse always worked for Ashley. Whenever she said she only trusted Stephen, he would feel sorry for her and rush to her aid, ignoring my objections. But this time seemed different. After hearing Ashley, Stephen looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for my reaction. Even David noticed and asked, "What is he waiting for? Does he expect you to stop him?" I patted his shoulder, smiling. "You're overthinking. This has nothing to do with me." Hearing this, Stephen looked dejected. Seeing this, Ashley turned to me. "Linda, Stephen and I are just friends. Friends help each other. Isn't that right?" I smiled and nodded. "Yes, you're right. Since you're best friends, Stephen should always be there for you." Ashley was thrilled. "See? I knew you were the best, the most understanding. You wouldn't be jealous of Stephen helping me." But to her surprise, Stephen ignored her. David sensed something was off and quickly paid the bill, taking me away, leaving the two of them to deal with it. Later, I heard that Stephen lost control that day. He violently tore off Ashley's necklace and pushed her to the ground, causing her hand to get cut by the broken pieces, bleeding profusely. Mr. Smith had to bail him out of the police station. Not long after, Mr. Smith called me, sounding exhausted. "Linda, Stephen was out of line, but could you come see him? Just as a favor to me." Considering the close relationship between our families and Mr. Smith's past help to mine, I reluctantly agreed and brought David along. Chapter 8. I didn't mean to. I just didn't want David to worry. Stephen lay in the hospital bed, his eyes lighting up when he saw me, but dimming when he noticed David. I pretended not to notice. "Mr. Smith said you weren't feeling well. My dad asked me to check on you." I was polite. I placed the flowers and fruit on Stephen's bedside table, acting considerate but distant. Mrs. Smith glanced at me and David, wanting to say something but holding back. Stephen's hand trembled as he reached for me, holding our engagement ring. If I remembered correctly, he had given this ring to Ashley on our engagement day. His voice was small. That day, nothing happened with Ashley. She just wanted to see the ring, so I took it off for her. She said she lost it, and I thought it didn't matter since we had wedding rings. But then I saw her wearing it on a necklace, so I took it back. "Linda, it's still the same ring." He didn't finish his sentence. Could we go back to how things were? Because I raised my hand to show him my ring finger. This ring was from David. We had agreed to pretend to be a couple. He helped me deal with Stephen, and I helped him avoid his family's pressure to marry. I remember the day his parents forced him to go on a blind date. He brought me along as a shield and put a ring on my finger in front of his parents. So today, visiting Stephen, he insisted I wear the ring. It worked. Stephen didn't finish his crucial sentence. As we left, I told Mr. Smith that my relationship with Stephen was over and asked him not to interfere with my life anymore. I threw myself into work, not thinking about Stephen. But David often checked on me, saying my mom asked him to make sure I was eating well. With his scholarly looks, many new female employees at the company were smitten with him. One day at lunch, an intern asked him, "Mr. Miller, are you single?" David hesitated, then smiled and pointed to me. "You can ask Linda." The intern froze, then blushed and quickly apologized, saying she didn't mean to offend. I nudged David, scolding. "Didn't we agree to end this once the problem was solved?" He smiled, his tone nervous and embarrassed. "Your problem is solved, but mine isn't." "Linda, I have a request, will you consider me? Before leaving the company, he insisted on taking me to his house. We knocked for a long time with no answer, so I suggested, maybe your parents aren't home. Let's come back another day. But then we heard a response from inside. Someone's here coming. David's mother opened the door, smiling warmly, and invited me in. In the living room, his parents eagerly served tea and snacks. While David helped with dinner, his mother took me to his room and showed me a dried mango seed. Seeing my confusion, she made sure David couldn't hear before explaining. In high school, he brought home a mango and kept it on his desk, never eating it. At first, they thought he was just craving it, so they bought more, but he didn't eat any of them, just stared at the original one. Finally, they asked why, and he vaguely said it was a gift from a classmate. At the graduation party, the truth came out. When classmates visited, everyone ate mango slices prepared by his mother, except mine, which he had cut himself. Chapter 9. When David graduated from university, his mentor wanted him to stay. At first, he was determined to return, but then he changed his mind and stayed. Later, my mom told me he had a girlfriend. It ended just like that. Mom mentioned that pushing him to date wasn't about rushing him to marry, but hoping he'd move on from certain things. I'm sure he never told you he liked you for a long time. Thinking back to our past, many old memories resurfaced. In high school, classmates often teased us. Once, the whole class went hiking. No matter how much they persuaded, David refused to join. My desk mate suggested I try, and he agreed. At the graduation party, the cultural committee wanted him to host. He initially refused, but when they mentioned I was the co-host, he agreed. On graduation photo day, many girls wanted pictures with him, but he ignored them. He only agreed to the class photo and a solo shot with me. Now that it was out in the open, everything made sense. When I showed him our only photo together, he blushed. Do you need to explain? He closed his eyes. I like you, so what? Then he waited for my response, eyes shut. Instead, I kissed his cheek, making him open his eyes wide. Soon, our wedding invitations went out. He confessed. He noticed me because of my feelings for Steven. That sense of being favored made him jealous. Even if Steven wasn't worth it, I deserved better. We chose to have our wedding at the same place where Steven and I had planned our engagement. David wanted to help me heal from the past. Though I hesitated, I agreed. When booking the venue, the staff mentioned another couple's engagement in the room opposite ours, with the bride's name also being Linda. I laughed it off. On our wedding day, as we greeted guests, we saw the people in the other room. Steven stood across, wearing the same suit, smiling at me. He approached slowly, saying, Linda, can I make it up to you? I handed him an invitation. The engagement is off, but you're welcome to my wedding. He almost dropped the invitation. Across the room, relatives and friends, especially those who had mocked me, watched as I walked down the aisle with another man, their expressions complex. From then on, I never looked back. As for Ashley, she lost her job. The company was actually owned by Steven's aunt, who had tolerated her because of him. But she messed up a major client deal, changing everything. During a meeting, the client brought their spouse. Ashley, serving tea, twisted her ankle, spilling tea on the client. Everyone was embarrassed except Ashley. She didn't realize the severity of her mistake and even asked the client to help her sit down. The client's spouse stormed out. Steven's aunt called him to handle it. But this time, Steven didn't defend her, insisting on professionalism. So his aunt fired Ashley and spread negative news about her in the industry, making it hard for her to find work. Desperate, Ashley even went to Steven's house to plead, but the door remained closed. Later, Mr. Smith, visiting my house, sighed that Steven had finally grown up. Hearing this, I said nothing, just held the hand of the man beside me tightly.